Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Data Science Hangout. If you're joining for the first time, I'm Rachel. It's great to meet you. If this is your first Hangout, this is an open space for the whole data science community to connect and chat about data science leadership, questions you're facing, and what's going on in the world of data science. So we always want to create spaces where everybody can participate and we can hear from everyone. There's 3 ways that you can ask questions. You can jump in live and raise your hand on Zoom, seems to work well. You could put questions in the Zoom chat and feel free to just put a little star next to it if you want me to read it, or I could call on you to introduce yourself and add some context there too. We also have a Slido link that Tyler will share in just a second here, where you can ask questions anonymously too. Oh, she's ahead of me. I see it. I'd just like to reiterate that we love to hear from everyone, no matter your level of experience or area of work as well. But today, I'm so happy to be joined by my co-host for today, Tegan Bunsu Ashby. Tegan is a senior software developer at the Brooklyn Nets and also co-founder of Women in Sports Data. And Tegan, I'd love to start off by maybe having you introduce yourself and share a bit about your work.
Oh, well, we're so secretive. Like there's the joke about how the Brooklyn Nets are kind of like the Kremlin, but second rate. But at a high level, my job is to help win basketball games. And I do that by translating data into applications and insights and recommendations for how everybody within the Brooklyn Nets makes basketball related decisions. So in front office, so how we evaluate players for draft acquisition or trade, to the coaching staff of how do we best strategize how to defend the pick and roll.
Awesome. Can I ask you what's something that you're really excited about in regards to data lately?
Like data in basketball or data in general?
Yeah, data science in general or data in basketball, whatever's most exciting to you.
I'm really excited about computer vision in like broadcast technology. I don't know if that's so I'm a software engineer, and so really more data science adjacent. But yeah, something that we really struggle with is getting rich enough data sets on college players, or basically players who aren't on an NBA court, because one of the primary data sets that we use comes from cameras in every NBA stadium that tracks the player location, is tagged with events, but we don't have that for our draft, and something that would be really, really useful would be able to have that from television. But it's such a hard problem because the frames are jumpy. Sometimes like CV confuses like players on the wrong team, things like that. But having that would be immensely exciting.
Cool. As we're waiting for everyone to jump in with their questions too, I'd love to hear a little bit more about women in sports data and how you started that too.
Sure. So Women in Sports Data is kind of this groundswell event that a couple of my fellow amazing women in sports data from Houston Astros, Sarah Gallus and Diana Ma, who was a data scientist at the Los Angeles Lakers, we just really felt that we needed a space where we could kind of showcase our abilities and have a platform to talk in a real technical manner about how data is applied to sport, and just to have that opportunity. So I'm really fortunate that the Brooklyn Nets, I came to RGM with this idea of like, we really don't have a space for this. This doesn't exist. It's kind of a unique environment to work with in data. How would you feel if the Brooklyn Nets hosted it? And he was all about it, and just kind of started running from there.
That's great.
Oh,
And
I should probably like describe what the event is.
yeah, no, I was just going to ask you if we could share it in
Yeah,
the
so
chat window too, for people who are interested in joining in.
Of course, yeah. I'm a little bit in playoff fog, I have to admit. For those that are unaware, I'm mourning my second loss in a row. And I'm a little, this is super off topic, but I'm a little paranoid because I used to work for the Philadelphia 76ers. And the second year that that I was in the playoffs with the Sixers, we got swept by the Celtics. And so this is my second playoffs with the Nets. And get a little antsy, but different team, different parameters. Anyway, so the Women in Sports Data event is going to take place in Brooklyn in late summer. We're going to announce our official date in 10 days. And it'll be this event with a bunch of panels and talks by women working in sports across the technical spectrum. So not only analysts and data scientists, but software engineers like me who partner with our data team and turn those insights into applications for our vested stakeholders, because it's such a unique environment where you have a small coaching staff, a small front office. You really want to get them to interact with the data in a much more immediate way than you might in a traditional organization where you have like different layers to step through. And so concurrent to our one-day event in Brooklyn, we're going to be hosting a hackathon using what is looking like event-level player location data from soccer, sponsor to be announced. And that will take place over about a 6 to 8 week sprint over the summer. And we really wanted to have something that was supported with mentors for women and non-binary people interested in working with sports data, to get an idea of what is going to be most impactful and how do I look at this data. And even if I don't have sports domain knowledge, I have these technical skills. So how do I apply that to what is genuinely very interesting data at an abstract level?
That's great. I just put the link in the chat too, if anyone wants to check it out as well. But I know there's a lot of data scientists on the call as well. So I think it would also be great for us to hear how you work together with data scientists on your team as well.
Productionizing models is a large part of my job. And I think traditionally my favorite part of my job, but over the past couple of years, I've really been getting into like the very front of the stack. So I've been doing a lot of data visualization. And so what sometimes will happen is that a data scientist will build out a visualization in Matplotlib or ggplot and like doesn't necessarily want to productionize it in a shiny dashboard. Like we need it to be a little bit more robust. It needs to talk with a different database. So I take that and I turn it into D3 code, and it lives on our Brooklyn Nets application, and it's just a lot more accessible and intuitive for non-data fluent users. And the odd SQL query.
I'm curious what that transition looks like, or that handoff from the different teams, or how you work together.
So I think everyone is very surprised by how small our teams are, but we're six people. And we're about 50-50. We're 3 data scientists and 3 developers. And really, I wish I could say that it was very formalized, but because we operate more on the basketball calendar than a development calendar, I have project manager friends who would probably scream at our processes. But often it's kind of like, oh, like so-and-so asked me to do this, or this is our development plan. Do you have time in your schedule to turn it into something a bit more robust?
I realize that wasn't very nice of us to do this in the middle of playoffs for you, but thank you for joining us. Sep,
maybe it'll turn the corner.
Yes. Although I can't say that, I'm in Boston, but Sep, I see you asked a question in the chat if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Tegan. Nice to meet you. Thanks for taking the time to speak with everybody. I'm a little bit more on the software side as well. That's at least my kind of background. So I'm always curious as to how every team kind of, in this case, very literally team, but how every team basically what they use in terms of their software and then kind of data infrastructure. If you don't mind speaking to that, if you can.
So like I said, we tend to be very secretive, even down to the stack, which I've always found kind of strange. I had a mentor who told me a story about how someone from the Clippers had called him and was interrogating, like, what's the stack? Like, what do you guys use? Like, are you on Snowflake? What do you think of? Whatever. And my mentor was like, yeah, I just like told him like all of this, and the person was like, oh, this is like really great stuff, and it was just like, like typical stuff, like this is our data warehouse, this is like the framework that we use, like this is our back end. I think I'll get in trouble if I disclose the net stack, but usually like in job ads for data engineers or software developers, I've noticed that teams kind of are tending to disclose that. So sorry for a non-answer.
No. I respect that. I appreciate it. Highly competitive environment. I get it.
I know that was Tegan, that also came up in building the community as well. And you mentioned how like a lot of times like you can't talk to other teams, but during COVID, that was also really hard. And especially for women in sports data too. I was wondering if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah. So when I started in sports, I was pretty much explicitly told, like, don't talk to people on other teams, like, don't disclose what you're working on. Every single thing that you do is a competitive advantage. And on the technical side, like, that's somewhat true, because different teams have different investments and different capacities for investments in how they're able to use data. So for example, when I was with the Sixers, I was also on a very large team, but there are teams in the NBA that might have maybe only one or two people that are basically data unicorns, and I'm sure very, very tired. So my experience in sports has only been to specialize, but I didn't really know the landscape then. And as I got further in my career, I noticed that one of the advantages that my male coworkers, both in research and development as well as basketball operations, had was they knew people on other teams. And once COVID hit, I kind of realized, oh my God, like I'm all alone. And I was very fortunate in the Sixers that I worked with an amazing data scientist, Savannah Sarich. She's now with Overtime Elite running their research. And it just kind of felt like I really wouldn't want anyone to feel like an island, to feel like they were alone. And because women, especially on sports teams and with a data background, like it already, tech is so male dominated, and then to intersect that with sport, it's hard, right? Like you have such unique experiences, and of course, like you're not going to say like, oh, we're preparing for your team like this, or we're targeting, this player. But you can talk about some of the more mundane things that happen when working for a sports team, and also some of the more serious things that happen. So about a year ago, I started a Slack community for women working in basketball specifically, to just kind of get to know each other. And it just blossomed into this amazing community, so supportive. Like we've been on Slack all today. But yeah, it was kind of that, and that first seed, and then Diana, one of my co-organizers, and I got to talking of like, how can we how can we grow this? Why didn't we have this before? How can we make sure that, the next woman that works for a team and doesn't have like not only another woman in her department, but another woman like in the entirety of basketball. And it was also something that I really felt compelled to do when I joined the Nets. I'm the only woman in the front office here, and I'm one of the only women in a front office in the entirety of the NBA. And to me, like that's literally insane, because data and software skills, like that should be one of the more equitable ways to enter into sports. And it's such a high visibility, high cultural impact role. I mean, like you look at my former boss, Daryl Morey, or Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, who's the new GM of the Minnesota Vikings, and they both have technical roles. And this is kind of a pathway to build the resume and the experience of being in sports and getting to the very, very top of leadership. And there's also kind of a dialogue on the coaching side of like, how come, when are we going to see the first female NBA head coach? And there's usually like one or two names who are commonly cited of like, who's that going to be? And yet the number of assistant coaches who are women has remained stagnant. And I think it's less than 10 now. It's not very high.
It's impressive that so quickly you've grown this community as well.
It's a small community.
Well, the symposium itself, I've seen a lot of interest on it. But I see, Zach, you had asked a question around some of the data competitions. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I'm more an NFL fan. I know there's the Big Data Bowl, as I'm sure you've heard of, which is the NFL's open source data community where they give out like GPS data. Helps like give access to more people to show off their skills. Is there stuff in like that in the NBA? Because I'm presuming that's one of the big things in helping show off more diversity and allow more people access to this information. Because of course, traditionally it'd just be whoever's in the teams have access to this data. And of course, that tends to be the same people, which isn't really diverse or etc.
Right. And it's very expensive too. I know. So our main data provider right now is a company called Second Spectrum. And I know that there are some people in the media who have subscriptions, but really you need to have it's minimum five to six figures just for access. So typically that type of data is not open source. I'm not sure if older data sets from Second Spectrum or the previous company, SportView, are available. And that's really just more from like my privilege of having a different bank account responsible for paying for that API. But the NBA used to hold a data competition before pre-COVID, and I really hope they do it again. But this is kind of the goal of the Women in Sports Data Hackathon, is to get different providers to donate that that tracking data, or at least event level player location data. And I'm being very coy about this because we haven't officially signed our contract for that. But yeah, like these rich data sets that show like where are players, what events are associated with an action, and how do you build a model on top of that? And also critically, I think for the NFL Big Data Bowl is that there's a very large prize associated with it. So it's very motivating to dig in. It's freely available on Kaggle. But you also, like, okay, like I'm doing this work. It's definitely going to be valuable either for a team or a league. How do I make sure I'm not exploited for it?
Thank you.
Thank you. Be very interesting to see.
I see, Mike, you asked a question as well around managing requests. Would you want to jump in?
Yeah, apologies, Tegan. This is something you kind of ended a sentence with about 10 minutes ago, but I think the diversity question is possibly a better one. But it was something you said about prioritizing work and prioritizing requests for your time. And this is something that I'm wrestling with at the minute. You know, people come to your door and knock and say, hey, can you do this for me? And you've got to kind of weigh up, well, look, how long is that going to take? Is this something that's, you know, an afternoon or a week or longer? And can you talk any about the difference between, okay, this is just a quick amount of time, so I can get this done in an hour or in an afternoon and then we're done, versus things that are like strategic, where you might think this may not be a high priority, but if I get an answer to this, it will unlock a bunch of other stuff. So how, you know, how do you, what are the, what's the identifiers for, you know, quick versus strategic?
It's so tricky because I feel like working in sports, we have multiple full-time jobs, right? So I'm full-time role is being a software engineer. And then I have another full-time role of being a front office person. So, you know, I have to understand my domain of, you know, having an opinion on basketball in the league and upcoming games. So I don't think that this is a solved problem by any means with my team or around the league. But I've been talking to a lot of like project managers, like how exactly, like, how do I solve this question? Because we don't have enough room to, you know, appoint, you know, like a scrum master or like a guard dog, essentially, to say like, no, like, I protect my engineers' time, like let them do their thing. And something that's kind of wild right now. So this is not actually my office. My office is in something we call very cutely the war room. I think it's like very common in sports to call it the war room. And I have strong opinions on this. But because it's kind of the node of where our organization lives, it's great because, you know, people, there's not a wall between R&D and the rest of basketball operations, but then like you'll have 20 guys gathered around and like watching film or like talking to the scouts. And so it's like, how do you sit down and say like, I have like this really difficult problem that like I have to like enter the matrix to solve. And if there if there's various like fires around me, then it's not going to get solved until it's too late. So I've been trying to kind of put on like, what's my project manager hat. Like we do, you know, stand-ups on a weekly level and, you know, coordinate all of our processes through GitHub. But as far as like determining at a high level, what's an emergency versus like what's our long-term research prerogative. And then something also that's very important to me is making sure that everybody on our team has room to learn and that time is protected. You know, that concept of 20% time where like I can't really explain or sell to say like my GM of like, we're going to invest a lot of time on, you know, working on computer vision. It may or may not work. And you're not going to see like a direct outcome of that project. But if it does, then it's going to be extremely valuable and it's going to be significant advantage. But like, I can't promise that. So I try to protect like that 20% time of just like, this is just like learning. This is just personal development. This is experimental. And like, yes, you know, projects that we come up with and experiments that we do are kind of geared towards understanding the game of basketball better and to gain a competitive edge, but are a little bit more closely aligned with, you know, that technical maintenance. So that's about like 1 day a week, and it's a little bit more flexible during our off season, post draft in the summer before training camp. And then we kind of have to balance like, most of my team has been in basketball for many years. So we can kind of anticipate like what the cadence of the season, like what are the kind of questions can we either like anticipate and build out like what is like, okay, like we didn't crash the glass well enough. Like we know that what the question is going to be the next day. And so like we have resources of, here's the study that we did a year ago on this question. Here we've applied new data to it now. This is what we might recommend, or this is what we would look into. And then like the one-off requests, we try to be pretty like on top of that, depending on who's asking. And I think like that comes more from organizational structure and having strong leadership from the top, and like a lot of buy-in, which I feel very, very fortunate to have. But also approachability is really important. So I wouldn't want our department to feel inaccessible, or anybody in our department to feel inaccessible, even to like the new grad basketball operations assistant. Frequently we've gotten questions of like, oh, I'm really interested in what you're doing. It can even be like super beginner, like how do I like I have this question with X domain, like how would I start to learn R, or like can you show me how to query the database, like what does that look like? And so we try to like build tools to empower different levels of users, both from their role, but also their comfort with technology, and to make sure that there's not this hard line between R&D and basketball. And then there's something the former director of R&D for the Milwaukee Bucks recently told me. He's like, I don't have a tech job, I have a basketball job. And I thought, oh, I've never really thought, I've thought it more like I have a tech job in a basketball team. And I think that's really more like a difference of philosophy of like, how do you protect that? And also how do you make sure that the goal, right? Like the goal in business, in basketball is the same as any other business, which is to succeed. Like it's just a little bit more literal for us, like to win.
I really like that idea of protecting the 20% of your team's time. And I know that can be so hard sometimes too. So how do you actually go about doing that in practice?
Personally, I try to make sure that I have like literally like 20% of my time during the week logged on some other like research or development initiative that I'm interested in. It's very difficult to do during the season because we play games on weekends, we play games late at night, and it's almost, it feels a little unreasonable to say, this is a 9-to-5 job, but also you need to show up at the arena at 6:30, or go straight from the practice facility to the arena and show up the next morning. So we're pretty relaxed on like, you're responsible for managing how you want to see your time, and like there are only like true like real emergencies, and they're not going to come from our department.
Thank you. I see there's a few anonymous questions coming in too, and one was, how do you see sports analytics evolve over the long term? Is it more proprietary advanced algorithms, or more proprietary data, or something else?
So there's this book called The MVP Machine, and it's about player development in baseball. And I think that the biggest advances in sports analytics are going to be moving in that that direction. And like, how do you empower your quote unquote end users, your players, or even your front office to grow using database insights. I think that in basketball, because we are relatively small compared to a data team for, say, baseball, which will have departments in the dozens, like a true startup, that we will probably remain more of like the interlocutors. And some teams who are interested in like building out more models or taking on new experimental technical projects. I think that'll be more of a team prerogative rather than a trend. And like that advantage is going to be the same advantage that any team has in fielding personnel, right? Like it's how much money do you have to spend? But I do think that vendors and like the ability to not necessarily deliver modeling and insights to a team, but doing a lot of the processing power that would be expensive for us, and taking care of the sort of things that maybe a general manager doesn't like can't see the immediate impact. So like my example of like, I would love for my 20% time project to be working on computer vision projects, but is that if there were a vendor that could provide that, that might be a more efficient use of both our time and resources.
Thank you. I see there were quite a few other questions in the chat too. And Bala, you had a question around data privacy. Would you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I just want to understand how you keep tab on various data regulations, especially I'm sure each state has their own regulation. So how do you manage the metadata? How do you share models, or because it's data is key for everything?
Right. I mean, it's all proprietary and in-house. I'm not sure how you mean.
So the data basically would be associated with a player or a team. So team might be all right because it's a rolled up heuristic data, which is fine.
Right.
But if it is with the player, then you might need to, in Europe, we have GDPR, so we have to be compliant, and there are different data policies that we need to go through to use that data. I'm not aware how it is done in US, so that's where my curiosity came.
Sure. So the NBA Players Association has very strict regulations for how and what kind of data we can collect. So the inferences that we make from the data sets that we subscribe to or collect ourselves, like that's totally fine. But for instance, like you can't put a tracking chip in a ball. You can't have a player wear wearables in game. Like they have to give consent to do that, and then only within a particular context. And so, because we're really only dealing with 20 some, including our G League players. A pretty like limited set of players.
But have you thought through when it comes to scale, maybe 5 or 10 years down the line? Again, this question might be of relevance, right? Because right now you're talking about a very small data set which could be easily managed. But if you're thinking about like 5 years down the line, getting all the players' data and systemically capturing it rather than someone manually entering it, all these things would come into play, right? Or you're not thought your team has not thought through that state.
Well, I think that we're talking about a couple different sources for data. And yeah, like I'm struggling with this because I'm definitely like in my team brain right now. So it's really like not a question of going to scale, because we work at the service of these players, of these teams, and like we wouldn't be able to productionize or build a product that went public.
I see in terms of this data and the kinds of data that you use, Frank just had a question in the chat as well. Frank, do you want to jump in? I see Tatsu
Mute myself.
has love for this as well.
Yeah, so it's directly related here. All the on-court stuff makes a ton of sense to me. Like that's pretty clear. I'm always super interested in the player behaviors, or like really anyone's consumer behaviors, player behaviors. And as we get more data there, right? Like I actually don't have my Whoop on today, but right, like if I'm wearing my Whoop, I can help to a certain extent, right? There's some inaccuracies in the data and their models as well,
Yeah.
but like I can start to make better decisions about, right? Should I go easier on my run today? Should I go harder? And I'm wondering, like, do you and your team support some of that stuff? And then it makes me wonder, like, how it's cool, but then like how real time can you get with that, right? Like, can you make different decisions right before the game starts to say like, hey, this player, right? Like, look at their data, they're telling me they're fine, but if I'm the coach, like I want to make a different decision about playtime, start lineup. I don't know how
Sure.
those decisions get made.
Yeah.
I don't like, do you have any of that?
We have like a very robust and excellent player performance staff that does address like more of the like physiological and athletic question, like that data. But like I was saying, like a lot of this requires player consent and like player willingness to opt in, because you can't just say like, well, like take the example of sleep. Like sleep is such a huge concern in the NBA, because we play 82 regular season games. And so the travel distance, like if you're playing games every other night or back to back, and you're flying from New York to San Francisco to San Antonio, that is such a huge drain on your ability to perform at an elite level. How do you monitor, like, okay, like maybe you're not gonna, maybe you need to rest, or maybe like you shouldn't play at at a extremely hard level during practice, things like that. And I think that to previous questions point of like, what's the next direction in sports analytics? It is this kind of like behavioral question of like, one, how do you get players to opt in? Personally, I think that it has to be like, it can't be surveillance analytics. It has to be, what am I going to get out of this? And what do I want the team to know? And it becomes kind of tricky, because they're like, you want to optimize as a player, how am I going to perform, right? But you also need to be very careful of exposing like certain data to your team, because it can affect where how much your next contract might be, or if they know something about an injury I have, are they going to try and trade me, or like how much leverage do I have?
Got it. Yeah, those trade-offs make sense.
I like that idea of framing it though as, what am I going to get out of it? Like thinking of how we can all use that, even not with like players, but business stakeholders as well. I see there were a lot of other questions earlier. Mark, you had a question about like when you need to hire another full-time person. Do you want to jump in and add some context there?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I know you mentioned you have like a pretty small team. And this is tangentially related to Mike's question about balancing priorities. I guess, when do you like, what's the cutoff between we have all these different priorities, and some of them we can push back, and some of them, we'll just communicate that these are lesser, versus, hey, we need to accomplish all of this stuff, and we need to either expand the team or, offload something to a different team.
We always need at least one extra person, I think, both on the engineering side and on the data side. But a model, I think, that is maybe more successful for us is we almost have technical translators embedded in certain departments within basketball. So we have a director of coaching analytics who's the main liaison with the coaching staff, and he sits on the bench at every game and provides in-game analysis. But he also does modeling specifically related to gameplay. And I think a reasonable question is, like, should that be one role? Should it be distinct roles? How do you kind of merge a team if it were distinct? And then, like, what about departments that don't have that embedded technical person? So, like, our cap and strategy group is 2 people, but when I was in Philadelphia, cap and strategy was technically part of my department. We were officially, when I started, before we converted to research and development, we were strategy and analytics. And so, yeah, it's always tough because we're very lean, and it's almost like there are too many hats for one head. But at the end of the day, like, you're essentially a consulting group embedded with a team, and you have to respond to that more so than technical prerogatives that you might have as a team, and kind of negotiate, like, I think that the payoff, if we invest in this research direction, or if we build out this tool, then we'll save both our time as well as our stakeholders' time. So not a satisfying answer, I think. But
No, it's okay.
I don't think,
thank you.
yeah, I don't think that it's solved anywhere. And it's maybe not solved even by more people. My group in Philadelphia, we used to claim that we were 10, but that also included outside consultants who worked in academia and at Google Brain. And the work that our consultants did certainly dovetailed with the work that we did, but it wasn't, they're kind of insulated from the demands that those of us who are directly embedded with the team and have front office roles or coaching roles would have to support. So I don't know if maybe that's a better model, or maybe rather than directly contracting with consultants, you sign an exclusive contract with some kind of vendor, or even outsourced development. I'm not sure. I think everybody, it's more budget constrained than optimized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone put in the chat vibes, and I definitely agree with that.
I see there is also an anonymous question earlier around how much variation is there in the levels of data sophistication between different teams?
I don't want to get in trouble.
Or I guess it could be across different sports too.
Yeah. I think you can kind of tell based on public titles, which is maybe a funny thing for me to say, because the Nets are one of the few teams that don't have a public directory of their analytics staff. But I know that my friend Sarah Gallus, who's director of R&D for Houston Astros, does have a fairly large team that is amazingly, like, fairly equitable. So go Sarah. But yeah, like, she employs, like, for instance, an ML engineer. And, if we had, like, one person to be, like, explicitly an ML engineer, that would be incredible. I've always wanted, as I've mentioned a couple times on this chat, I really love a project manager, somebody who's like explicitly is to keep us all in line, and to serve kind of as that guard dog of time. But I'd also kind of love a designer, like to like really go like full stack.
Cool, thank you. On that topic, kind of like of the variation between different teams, I see, Chris, you asked a question around like reaching out to other sports organizations. If you're on, do you want to jump in? Or Chris maybe had to jump at the half-hour mark. But the question was, are you still able to reach out to other professional sport organizations to share data concepts like US Olympic teams or UFC, for example?
Yeah, we've definitely done some both data conversations of like, how would you approach this problem in football? How would you approach this problem in soccer? And you know, there are certain analogies in sport that do carry over. I think it depends on the comfort. It's really not R&D's call of how much you can share. It's probably going to be more the prerogative of an owner or a general manager. So fortunately here at Brooklyn, so we've been like pretty into having conversations with other pro teams outside of basketball to kind of do a temperature check on like, what are your processes like at a fairly high level, but also like even down to like the nitty gritty of data management, and how do you manage this with 6 people? How do you manage this with 12 people on your team? What would you do if you had like that extra engineer? But yeah, we definitely don't talk to basketball teams, but there are certain analogs, I think, in the types of actions that happen in basketball, or even like the structure of the leagues that are certainly parsable to, you know, like FIFA or hockey. And another advantage would be like if your ownership group has a multi-sport portfolio. So if your ownership group owns like a hockey team or a soccer team, then you're probably going to be doing some data sharing there. When I was on the Sixers, our ownership group owned the New Jersey Devils. And so in my contract, it literally said I could be seconded to the New Jersey Devils, in spite of not knowing anything about hockey. That high level, like how do you build out an application that's, you know, intelligible, is interactive, is easily digestible by somebody who is sport fluent but not necessarily data fluent. And you know, like there are certain touch points within competitive sport, like the prerogative across sport is how do you win, and there are decision points like a game or a draft or free agency, like that seems to be almost like fairly universal of how do you prepare for those instances, and like what are the best strategies.
It's interesting walking this fine line of like what is secretive or what can be shared. And I know that's with every industry too, like with pharmaceutical industries. I know they do a lot of open sharing and a lot of presentations and conferences with each other, but I'm sure there's a ton of stuff that they don't want to share with each other too. I know, Steve, you just asked a question in the chat if you want to jump in.
Hey there, yeah. So interesting chat. I'm trying to get obviously a little bit more details, which is how are you supported as software engineers? Is this something, do you self-support yourself? Do you have some sysadmins, or are you using third parties to actually do your administration? How do you look after yourselves?
Oh, great question. Are we doing a good job of that? I don't know. It's playoff season. We're very fortunate that we do have someone on our team who does take ownership of that. that role. For other teams, every option that you've listed, it certainly could be the direction that they choose. So it really kind of depends on, do you have enough resources to support somebody who would be internal, or do you have enough like time resources to self-support, or do you have enough financial resources where like you could outsource it and you can allow your team to focus more on the development and, you know, data pipelining and the immediate requests that your team stakeholders may have.
Yeah. So what proportion would you say of your, if you're assuming you're a group which is doing your, sounds like you're doing self-support, what percentage of time do you find is doing the data analysis, and what type is time is spent building servers or configuring servers to be able to, for you to use?
It's pretty role specific. So like I said, we're very fortunate to have one person on our team who spends the majority of their time in that role. But you know, because we're so small, we have to be empowered to handle it on our own.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There was an anonymous question as well, and I'm going to guess what one of the acronyms is, but how competitive is it to get into front office data science or software engineering roles for a sports team?
People say that it's very competitive, but I think that it ends up being very lucky. And yeah, as I was talking about earlier, it's supposed to be one of the more equitable ways to get into a front office or to work for a team, because you're supposed to be evaluated on your skill set and not whether you've played professionally before. I certainly haven't played in the NBA before. I've never played basketball even at a highly competitive level. I think that there are kind of like some secret tricks that people on the inside know, and everyone usually says that you have to build a portfolio with basketball related projects. You should have kind of an intuitive sense of like what might be useful for communicating data to a coach or to a front office within a specific domain like salary cap or scouting. But I personally didn't have a basketball portfolio. I didn't even really think, oh, like I have to work in basketball. So I think that like my experience is probably different and maybe unique. It's very difficult to get a role for a front office because they just don't come up that often. And when people are hiring, I think it's kind of like the greater trend in the data science and software engineering industries now, where everyone would love a senior developer or a senior data scientist, but nobody wants to hire an entry level person. And then how do you get an entry level job if that job's not advertised? Then it's what's your network? And it's a lot easier to build your network if you're already associated with basketball, or you have a lot of time to work on projects in a visible way for free. And I think that kind of shadow requirement is specifically disadvantaging women and people of color, because we have different responsibilities. We have different demands on our time. And oftentimes we haven't been told that, that's one of the blueprints to get a job in sports. And I just think that we as an industry need to be doing a better job of making sure that like that requirement, if it has to be a requirement, that we provide kind of a development pathway that's rewarded either through a hackathon. The NBA used to have one, or through Women in Sports Data, which will have cash prizes, but to specifically target and develop those communities to mentor them and tell them specifically, this is what we want in basketball, this is what we want in football. But I don't know, because teams are not going to grow in any significant sense. If you have an R&D department that's larger than the rest of basketball operations, then the people who keep the books are going to be like, well, why don't we just hire an outside organization to do this that sells the same information or does the same thing? Like, they're not going to understand the business case for a large department. So I don't think that positions, it's not going to be a growth industry, but you can use those same skill sets to get a job for a Second Spectrum or for a Hawkeye, or even in like traditional big tech that would love to provide services for sports. So for instance, Zach, he brought up Big Data Bowl, like that's sponsored by AWS, $100,000, and they are the named data provider. And so I think there's always going to be that pathway that will make people attractive to sports, but it's not really kind of a direct blueprint for doing it.
Thank you. I see there were a lot of questions we unfortunately didn't get to within the hour. So if people are on and want to jump in and ask their question, feel free to just raise your hand right now too, if there's anything that I missed. Trevor, I see you had asked one around measuring when you're making a difference. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hi everyone. So that's always my constant question, right? So clearly, when you're doing a project, you're always asking yourself, am I making a difference, or am I going to measure success, right? And clear, it's evident that more organizations, even here in Jamaica, actually getting more data science departments, hiring more analysts. It makes sense, right? But how do we justify our existence qualitatively and quantitatively? So in a sport like basketball that I like as well, is how do you know that you're making a difference in terms of the bottom line at the end of the day, if you understand what I'm asking?
Totally. I think that it's one of the joys and terrors of being in a data intensive role for a team is that you can't point to, oh, we did X, or we recommended Y, and now we have an NBA championship. But it really has to be, does analytics, does data and investment in data at a league level indicate that you're going to have sustained success? And I think that the investment in analytics departments and the success of the teams that have been able to do so is kind of indicative of how teams are evaluating the value that data provide. But I do think that's really nice to say, but we also need to hold ourselves accountable of like, we're using all this time and resources. Does it contribute to winning? Does it help help us make better decisions? And I think that it's almost a qualitative assessment of, at certain pressure points, did we create an environment where it was easier to negotiate a trade or pull the trigger on drafting a certain player over another, or even to the level of preparing for what happens on court? Like, did we create an environment of, all right, like we knew these tendencies, we could project this expected value. Were we able to support that in a way that it was actionable and retainable and implemented either at a player level or at a coaching level.
Thank you. I understand. It's not an easy answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tegan. I know we're taking you out of your work during playoffs. So do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for all that you do to open the doors to others to get into the sports analytics space as well, and the community building that you do. So just wanted to ask you if you have any tips for us who maybe want to do something similar in our own industries.
I wouldn't say that I'm a very active or fluent Twitter user, but I got some advice from my friend Kathy Evans, who is Vice President of Research and Development for the Washington Wizards, and also my friend Brittany Donaldson, who's former assistant coach for the Toronto Raptors and data analyst. And both of them are much better at social media than I am. But they told me, like, you're one of the only women in a technical role in the NBA, and 50% of NBA teams are hiring for software developers, and like nobody knows what that looks like, or that you can even do that as a job. And so I thought, oh, well, if just like through being visible, like that might help, then I obviously would love to do that. And then it just kind of made everything else as far as the community building so much easier, because I could see a response, and I met so many people, and it was easier to develop a connection, because I could reach out to somebody or they could reach out to me, and we could have something to talk about, whether it's like a thread that they wrote or an invitation to a community. So yeah, at a practical level, just being visible and making friends.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for jumping on and sharing your experience with us. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for all the great questions too. If there are some that I missed, I'll send them over to you, Tegan, if that's okay, through email.
Of course. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. You can always say hi on Twitter. I will never give you an opinion on a player because I cannot afford the tampering fine, but I'll do my best.
Awesome. I'll share your Twitter account right here in the chat too, if people want to go and follow. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.